Welcome everyone to session 5 entitled, Is the Elimination of COVID-19 Using Current Vaccines and Approaches Stalling? Do patients have to engage in co-creating new vaccine platforms? We are honored to have as moderator Dr. Shankar Ghosh, Advisor, Vaccine Delivery of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Joining us one is Dr. Socorro Escalante, Coordinator for Essential Medicines and Health Technologies of the World Health Organization Western Pacific, and we also have Dr. Aileen Dualan, Global Medical and Scientific Affairs Asia Pacific Regional Head of MSD. We also have Dr. Kashmira, Director of Global Medical Affairs for Vaccines of Johnson & Johnson's Global Public Health Organization. You can find their full biographies on the official Congress website. You may submit your questions for the speakers to the Q&A tab in the auditorium. I now invite the moderator, Dr. Shankar Ghosh, to the floor. Over to you, Dr. Raj.
Thank you. Can you hear me all? Okay. So I wanted to begin this very important conversation around, is elimination of COVID-19 possible with the current approach of the vaccine? And how do we really bring patients and the community people into the center of the entire program? The vaccination program, as you understand, is all around the three large buckets, what we call the P buckets. The first P bucket, excuse me, is the product, which is the vaccine, which needs to be a safe, efficacious, and affordable vaccine for the public, for the persons who are receiving the vaccine. The second is that there needs to be a place which is accessible, approachable, and acceptable to the people, to the community for accepting the vaccine. And the third is around the people, people who are trained to give the vaccine, people who are aware and and knowledgeable about the vaccine to receive the vaccine. In this whole context, if you see, the entire chain is around people. The vaccine is made for the people to be safe on the human body. The vaccination center is such chosen that people can access it. The people need to be a part of the planning process for vaccination and delivery. And finally, the people need to be are knowledgeable and aware of the vaccination program, the vaccine that they are receiving, and also the time and the site where the vaccine is being developed. In this context now, without much delay, please allow me to invite Dr. Socorro Escalante from WHO Western Pacific region and hear from her about WHO's approach to the larger Solidity trials and how we can bring people back to the the vaccine program. Over to Dr. Escalante.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raj. So as I mentioned, I will try to turn off my camera just to ensure that I will have a good flow of the presentation. So first and foremost, I am very privileged to be speaking along with the experts on vaccination, as well as our colleagues who are actually involved in the manufacturing of vaccines. So this is, I think, a very exciting opportunity, and thank you for inviting WHO. So next slide, please. So I will be speaking on how WHO has been working with experts and the global pharmaceutical industry, as well as patients and governments, to ensure access to life-saving technologies during COVID-19 the COVID-19. Next slide, please. And this is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to speak on the SCTA initiative, and then about COVID-19 vaccines, and then Solidarity trials, and about the living guidelines for therapeutics for COVID-19. Next slide. So let me begin with the ACTA initiative. Next slide. This is what we call the access to technologies for COVID-19. And this was put up or established in on the 22nd of April of 2021, wherein the world WHO partners and government leaders around the world celebrated the first year anniversary of the SCTA Accelerator. So it was established in 2020, and the first year of anniversary was in 2021. So this is the fastest and the most coordinated and successful global effort in history to develop tools to fight disease. So if you could see the small circles there, these are the tools that have been developed under this initiative. That includes therapeutics, includes vaccines, diagnostics, equipment, and also on strengthening health systems to effectively use these new tools for COVID-19. Next slide. So let me start on my discussion with COVID-19 vaccines. Next slide, please. So I would briefly describe here the collaboration for the development of COVID-19 vaccines. And on the blue boxes at the top, I'm trying to illustrate the process. And that is, of course, starting with the research and development, and then rigorous regulatory approval, and then it will go to the manufacture, procurement, supply, and delivery. Again, as I mentioned in my previous talk, it's very important to put in our mind that we were able to produce vaccines and other technologies in a short time, also because of the decades or more than decades of long research and work by our scientists and experts around the world. And also WHO has contributed a lot in terms of the development of norms and standards for the research and development, production, and regulations of vaccines. Many of you would know the COVAX facility, which was put up by different partners to ensure the availability and equity of vaccines to all countries, regardless of their economic status. And this was put up by CEPI, Gavi, the World Health Organization, and UNICEF, with the support of the research institution around the world, the academia, the industry, and of course the governments, who has been providing a lot of funding and support for the production of COVID-19 vaccines. Next slide. And this is current pipeline for the research and development. So there are at least 322 COVID-19 vaccines in the pipeline, 194 of which are still on the preclinical development, and 124 is already at the clinical stage. Of this, 35 are in the phase 1, 35 also in phase 1 and 2, and so on. But we now have 23 which are being registered in many countries and has passed regulatory approval, and 10 of which of these vaccines are already in the phase 4. That means that we are already testing or undertaking studies on the effectiveness in real world, as they are already being rolled out to the general population. Next slide. And this is currently the overview of regulatory approvals and WHO EUL. So there are at least 23 COVID-19 vaccines that are already used by countries to date, out of which 11 of them are under review by the WHO for the emergency use listing, and 7 of which has already been granted the emergency use listing certification of WHO. And that includes Pfizer, BioNTech, then we have the AstraZeneca, and including the Covishield that is also based on the AstraZeneca platform. We have the Janssen by Johnson & Johnson's. We have Moderna. We have two from the Chinese manufactured vaccines, that is Sinopharm and Sinovac. And the latest that was granted WHO emergency use listing is the the Covaxin that is produced by Bharat Biotech in India. Next slide. Next slide, please. So I borrowed this, previous slide. So this slide, which I borrowed from the IFPMA, is showing the complexity of the vaccines production and the number of tests that has to be undertaken when the vaccines are going to be manufactured. And these are all undertaken, again, to ensure the safety and quality of vaccines. Next slide. And if we are going to look in terms of the vaccines rollout, this is an overview of the percentage of the total population that is fully vaccinated across the WHO member states. The green one there are with very high vaccination coverage, and then the yellow with around 20 to 40% of the total population covered by 2 doses of vaccines. The orange there would be 10 to 20%, and the red and the dark red are those that are below 19% or below 10% of coverage. So we see that there is a lot of disparities in terms of availability and access, as well as the coverage of vaccines across the world. And I'm going to tackle a little bit of this in the last slide. But if we are going to see the coverage of the population in the bar graphs, we would see that the Western Pacific region countries has relatively high coverage as compared to the other regions. Next slide, please. So we will now go on to the Solidarity trials. So this is to WHO's contribution, again, to ensure safety and efficacy of therapeutics and vaccines. Next slide. We have 2 types of Solidarity trials. One is for vaccines and therapeutics. So the Solidarity trial, we regard them as the unprecedented international collaboration to identify life-saving treatments and vaccines for COVID-19. And this is a large global randomized controlled trial designed to provide robust results on whether a drug can save lives in those hospitalized with severe or critical COVID-19. So the value of the Solidarity trial is, 1, it empowers local researchers and provides them with opportunities to contribute their expertise and resources to the global research needs. It provides a global platform for trials to help the world prepare for future pandemics, not only for COVID-19. And it could open a new global approach to the robust evaluation of several therapeutics as we respond to this pandemic, and again, to prepare for the future ones. Next slide, please. So this is the Solidarity trial for therapeutics. It's now being undertaken in 52 countries, where 600 health facilities and hospitals are the sites of this clinical trial, with 14,200 subjects that are enrolled and 2,000 researchers are involved. So it is truly an engagement of physicians, doctors, and patients, as well as researchers. And the results of this Solidarity trial are outlined in what we call the Living Guideline for Therapeutics for COVID-19. And I'm not going to discuss the specific therapeutics or medicines and the results of this clinical trial, because they are really quite complex. So I would really refer you to access and have a read of the results of these clinical trials that have been undertaken so far, and what are the recommendations for WHO for each of these types of therapeutics. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to tackle the Solidarity trial for vaccines. Again, this is an international, individually randomized controlled trial to rapidly evaluate promising new vaccines for COVID-19. And it is led by the World Health Organization and co-sponsored by WHO and other ministries of health. And it is delivered again on a global scale. So we have a flexible, we have flexibility to work across countries, settings, and populations. Next slide. So why do we need a global trial of promising COVID-19 vaccines? Again, as I mentioned, there are already existing nationally approved vaccines that are being used in the general population, but they are inadequate to meet the world's needs. So we need to enroll more vaccines and to expand the availability of other vaccines to cover the needs of the populations around the world. And this Solidarity trial also aids in generating information to answer questions such as, how will vaccines respond to COVID-19 new variants? Or how long will vaccines protect people for? So there's still a lot of questions that we need to know in terms of the safety and efficacy or effectiveness of vaccines. The vision, again, is, of course, for everyone to have access to COVID-19 vaccines. And as I mentioned, and I will repeat again, the trial could help lead to a larger portfolio of vaccines for COVID-19 to protect people across the world and help to ensure that no one is left behind. Next slide. So we call the Solidarity trial that is being now undertaken to have an adaptive design, which means that the trial can change or the design can change as it progresses. We could incorporate vaccines that are candidate vaccines that are that are new from ongoing research and development, but the vaccines can also be dropped if we already see, if the trial or is already seeing the results at an early stage. And then, as mentioned, others, new vaccines can be added if they meet the WHO criteria. The target audiences for vaccination and locations can also be changed, and the comparison can also be changed, such as, for example, are we going to use placebo as a comparator, or we're going to use vaccines that are already available nationally as a comparator for the clinical trial. So this is the very general description of what we call an adaptive design that is being employed in the Solidarity trials for vaccines. Next slide, please. And WHO has come up with a criteria on which vaccines can be included. One, and again, there is an independent panel of scientists and vaccines experts that assess candidate vaccines on their safety and potential efficacy in previous studies, stability, whether they can be stored and transported easily under normal conditions, whether the availability can be assured and they can be produced quickly for global distribution, and how easily they can be given to individuals. Next slide. So what are being measured? Again, the experts in the room would maybe add to this. So we have what we call the primary endpoint and the secondary endpoint. And the primary endpoint for the Solidarity trial is that the key outcome of the trial is whether the trial vaccines will reduce the risk of people being diagnosed with COVID-19. And the criteria for a successful vaccine in the trial is if it delivers at least a 50% reduction in the risk of a person getting COVID-19. And the secondary endpoint would be the level of immune response from trial participants that are generated by the trial. Next slide. So this is my last slide, a second to the last slide, and I just really want to make a pitch on vaccines equity. Again, it's very important for us all to bear in mind that no one is safe until everyone is safe. So the upper arrow is really about improving access and reducing inequity And we are able to achieve that by ensuring there is solidarity in supply and distribution. WHO has been looking at a lot of how high-income countries are procuring their vaccines, but we are also very happy to see that a lot of manufacturers and rich countries are now starting to share their vaccines to lower and middle-income countries. And we continue to support global initiatives to expand the production of vaccines. There is now an initiative of technology transfer wherein the low and middle income countries are being capacitated or supported to be production hubs of vaccines. And there has been a lot of financing that are generated for the production hubs. Another important side of the vaccines is the effective use of vaccines. We have always been saying that vaccines are a very important tool to fight and to end this epidemic. So we need to prioritize use our vaccines effectively by ensuring that we prioritize who will be vaccinated. And at the earliest part, our goal is to reduce death and to reduce the overwhelming of our health systems. Therefore, we need to prioritize our healthcare workers and the vulnerable populations, such as the elderly and those that who have comorbidities. Once we have covered those, we could expand the vaccination of for primary doses to the rest of the eligible population, which are 18 and above. Of course, the strategies for vaccination will change depending on the availability of the evidence that we have, such as there are now a lot of discussions and movement governments initiating booster doses and additional doses for certain parts of the population. It is also very important to ensure that there is timely deployment of the vaccines. Once the vaccines reach the countries, then we need to ensure that the vaccines will reach the beneficiaries, and WHO has been involved with UNICEF and other partners with Gavi in closely monitoring the expiry and wastage of vaccines and really to avoid the expiry of vaccines at the country level. And next slide, please. And that will be my last slide. In summary, the world has really seen an unprecedented development and rollout of health technologies, especially vaccines, during a pandemic. And again, this was made possible by the decades of work on research and development, the formulation of norms and standards, the strengthening of regulatory systems, and the availability of financing to roll out vaccines that are safe, effective, and quality assured. There have been many challenges that we have faced altogether, including the equity and effective use of vaccines, as I have already mentioned. However, it's very important that patients, health workers, leaders, and decision makers can support the effective use of vaccines by accessing the right information and using evidence to guide decision making. So with that, again, thank you so much for this opportunity to present the process of WHO's work on COVID-19 vaccines.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Socorro, for this excellent presentation and really highlighting the fundamental statement of public health that while, it is very important for us to have efficient R&D and regulatory processes to have safe and efficacious vaccines, ultimately the world will be saved not by vaccines, but by vaccination. Therefore, equity and coverage and ensuring that, everyone, everywhere gets the vaccine or has the opportunity to get the vaccine is what counts. So with this, now I will, move to Dr. Aileen, and Dr. Aileen will really talk to us about how we can engage public and patients more in this entire journey of COVID vaccination, and also, highlight some of MSD's treatments which are there, and also speak a lot on the collaboration efforts. So over to you, Dr. Aileen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raj. So are we ready for the next pandemic? As an epidemiologist, this is a question I go around asking people, and I always get incredulous looks. We haven't even figured out how to get through this one yet. And yet I'm already asking how we will get through the next one. Well, I have news. When the first SARS pandemic broke out in 2003, that broke out across our region in several Asian territories, including Singapore and Taiwan, governments in these countries already asked that question. Some countries actually acted on it, working out very robust pandemic response plans, but nothing has prepared us for the unprecedented scale of the COVID-19 pandemic. So even the best governments with the best response plans could not really keep up with what we have seen with COVID-19. So what have we learned that we can apply to the future? So maybe my first observation is this pandemic has really allowed many different sectors to collaborate on an unprecedented scale. Governments, non-government organizations, the WHO, academia, businesses, industries, and previously unimagined alliances have come together to address this. And the industry, the pharmaceutical industry, is rising to this unprecedented challenge. We really need to work together and ensure that we continue to invest in helping address the greatest threats to health security. The COVID-19 pandemic is unrivaled in scientific and global health challenges and demands collaboration across different sectors from the community, not just the scientific community, but the public as well. So the industry's efforts to combat the virus are creating new approaches to address pandemic. And I really hope that our learnings from this COVID-19 pandemic will take us through to the next one. The authorization of COVID-19 vaccines is good news for our industry and our society. Actually, I can share with you that MSD, we had 2 candidate vaccines, but just to show you how difficult it is to produce vaccines, we actually dropped out of the race. So what are we doing now in terms of the pandemic response? I'm actually honored to share today's stage with my colleagues from J&J, Dr. Kashmira, right? She will talk to you about their vaccine. But I also wanted to share with you that on an unprecedented scale, company like MSD is actually manufacturing J&J's vaccine. So this is something that we've never seen before, right? This kind of collaboration across the industry. In addition to co-manufacturing J&J's COVID-19 vaccine, we are also advancing an oral antiviral agent. So this has actually gathered a lot of news lately because this oral antiviral agent will actually treat COVID-19 in the very early stages of disease before patients can actually go to the hospital. So you can imagine that for these kinds of investigational agents, it is really very important to engage the patients and the public, because these are patients who will be seen before they are seen in the hospital. They will be seen in the clinics and in the communities. So it's very important for companies who work with such early agents to engage with patients before they are seen in the hospitals. And this is really where the public health initiatives and engaging in public health experts needs to happen. We have a long track record of making our medicines and vaccines accessible and affordable globally. And we remain committed to ensuring global access to our oral investigational agent. We've actually already manufactured, even before we have the FDA approval, we've manufactured several millions of doses and courses that we will be distributing around the world. And again, on an unprecedented scale, we actually gave up the voluntary licenses. We've granted voluntary licenses to generic manufacturers in order to increase the affordable supply of this oral investigational agent around the world. So we have some countries here in Asia who are high income or middle income countries, and some who are lower income countries. they will all be able to access this oral agent because of the way we have tiered the pricing for this particular agent, and as well as providing licenses for generic manufacturers to actually be able to produce supply for some of our markets here in Asia. In addition to that, we also signed a voluntary licensing agreement with the medicines patient pool to facilitate affordable global access to this agent. So we believe that vaccines are still the foundational cornerstone of addressing this pandemic. And for that reason, we are supporting our peer J&J in producing their vaccine. But at the same time, we also feel that we need to address the therapeutics part of the pandemic. And that is where the oral investigational agents of MSD come in. Now, the second point I want to make is patients and the public have a role to play in pandemic preparedness. Back in 2009, the WHO actually wrote guidelines for pandemic influenza preparedness. And if I may quote from those guidelines, they actually said, we need to have a whole of society approach. In short, it cannot just be industry, it cannot just be governments. We need to involve all of society, which would include communities, individuals, and families, civil society organizations, families, individuals, and traditional leaders all have essential roles to play in mitigating the effects of an influenza pandemic. So that is something they said back then. But what actually happened during this COVID-19 pandemic, even in countries where great strides in incorporating the patient voice into healthcare policy and decision-making, for example, the UK or the US, they actually noted in studies and reviews of what happened during the pandemic that the policymakers' choice of expert advisors excluded patients and the general public. So this is actually published data from the UK, for example. And despite the increase in COVID-19 related research, whether it is for vaccine development or therapeutics development, there was an associated drop of patient and public involvement in advising research experts, where only 22% of the studies had patient or public involvement. So what can we learn from this, right? I would now like to request us to move to the next slide because I do want to share the interesting efforts of MSD. So I'm actually showing here a recreational vehicle or an RV, but it's like a huge van, right? It's a huge van that actually MSD used this in the United States to go to where the patients are to educate them about the trials. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this, right? Because in the US FDA had expressed concern for patient safety during the conduct of clinical trials. And they had made some adjustments to clinical trial guidance that would make trials more patient-centric. But at the same time, they had to make concessions to mitigate the exposure risk of patients by incorporating more remote elements to clinical trial conduct. So one innovation that MSD introduced to bring trial awareness closer to patients was this RV, which we call ILAB 53. It's a 39-foot van with mobile clinical research space outfitted with medical grade equipment and a modular interior. And it is designed to be a self-contained unit that could be set up anywhere in the world, customized for a variety of purposes, from obtaining laboratory specimens to conducting focus groups. So actually what happened is by using data and analytics, we identified where the pockets of outbreaks were happening in the US. And we decided on 2 cities in Florida where the cases were spiking. and we deployed the van there. And in the first 2 weeks in the field, more than 150 people stopped by the lab. And those who actually qualified and met clinical trial inclusion criteria were tested on the spot and then referred to a clinical trial investigational site nearby. So I think this is one area, one place where we can really innovate, right? Instead of waiting for patients to come to the hospitals, we need to go to where the patients are, especially for a disease that's really affecting communities. And this is actually a lesson that we learned from our Ebola experience. Then I have one final slide.
Dr. Aileen, we will have to wrap up, so just quickly. Thank you.
Yes. So just one final slide. I just wanted to mention that we did eventually consult patients on the patient perspective in COVID-19. And I invite you to come to the MSD website to look at this special patient report. One of the rapporteurs actually was our the IAPO's Dr. Ratna Devi. So she was actually one of the respondents for this special report to provide the patient perspective. And I think I will end there to give time to the next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Dr. Aileen. We will move to Dr. Kashmira after this, but just before I move, I wanted to recall what one of our professors in public health had told us, that in order to have a good public health program, we need three things, three Ps, 3P mantra. The first is a good policy, which is people friendly. The second is a good plan in order to ensure that everybody gets it. And the third is good partnership. And what Dr. Aileen just now spoke about is that the value of partnership in ensuring that we have a very successful vaccination program. So with this, over to Dr. Kashmira to hear from Johnson's point of view. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh. And again, I'm privileged to be here along with all of you to talk about all of the efforts that have gone on in this unprecedented space right now. Next slide, please. So, I won't repeat things that my colleagues have already said, Aileen and Dr. Escalante and Raj, you mentioned a lot of these issues as well. So maybe I'll try to connect some of these points together and bring a more complete picture of how we were viewing some of the things in this space. Next slide, please. So, before I go into the COVID space, I just wanted to highlight again here that the whole, vaccine and immunization space is not new, right? Like we all know that the expanded program on immunization has been in existence for a long time. And when Gavi came along to make sure that some of the new vaccines would become available to, especially the poorest countries in the world, really needed this sort of partnership approach to bring, all of the different partners together in the public as well as the private realm. So, this really kind of highlights that important partnership that was brought together. Next slide, please. And so, and then comes COVID, right? And as both Dr. Socorro and Raj, you mentioned, as well as Dr. Aileen, that this unprecedented situation really called for unprecedented action. And, we've already discussed about the ACT Accelerator program that really brought together the different partners and the different pillars to make sure that there was this global collaboration for equitable access to the diagnostic, therapeutics, and vaccine space. So, again, a very, very unique partnership that brought together all of these key partners in a very, very short time frame to make things happen for COVID-19 control with this pandemic. Next slide, please. So, this may be a little bit hard to read with all of the text, but what I wanted to highlight here in this with IFPMA, as Dr. Socorro already showed, the kind of efforts that go into vaccine manufacturing, the journey of a vaccine, right from when a candidate goes from a molecule to a actual vaccine candidate phase, and then moving on for actual, implementation at the program level, all of the steps that are involved, everything happened at that unprecedented space. The pharma partners came together along with the public health partners. So this was really very, very important to make sure that that sort of trust, transparency, and information availability was shared between all of the partners as quickly as possible, and as to make sure that vaccines were available in a safe, effective, and impactful manner to be used within populations that needed them the most. Next slide, please. So, again, I'll use our vaccine as an example, and what were some of the efforts that went into making this happen. So what you see in red here are basically all of the timelines associated with the pandemic. When was the first genome sequencing that was released? When did, from our perspective as a company, the vaccine identification of a vaccine candidate started, and then when a vaccine became available. So all of these different steps we outline here, as you can see, none of the actual steps were shortcutted or compromised in any kind of way, but it just is because of this unprecedented partnership that came together that vaccines became available so quickly, for pandemic control. Next slide, please. So, again, highlighting what my colleagues have already said, that, again, we think that this is extremely important here to make sure that vaccines become available to all of the populations that need them the most. So from our end, we have committed to equitable access to many, many millions of people at risk for COVID-19, especially in low and middle income countries. And again, many, many thanks to our partners, including in the pharmaceutical industry space with Merck, as Dr. Aileen mentioned, that there is this partnership now to make sure that vaccines are manufactured at scale, because we know that this is going to need many millions of doses in the next very few months coming up. So, this just sort of highlights in the last two columns, we highlight this sort of partnership that we have with the African Union as well as with COVAX to make sure that vaccines are delivered through these mechanisms to the low middle income countries, to resource limited settings, which are at high risk for COVID-19. Next slide, please. So what do we want to do from this experience that we've had? Again, this sort of unprecedented approach, how quickly these things could be made available. We want to make sure that we learn from these experiences, we build on these experiences. So, as my colleagues were saying, how are we going to be prepared for the next pandemic? What is going to be our proven public health approach? So what we've learned works. And there are also things that we've learned that, we really need to make sure that we build on and we rectify in the future. So we've learned that, all of the investments that went into the R&D pipeline really was important to make sure that this was, the vaccines became available to the most vulnerable very quickly. Developing that sort of end-to-end approach, making sure that the most vulnerable are also highlighted and also, prioritized during this unprecedented approach, and then making sure that there are these different partnerships that we leverage going forward. So, we want to make sure that we build on these experiences. Next slide, please. Again, I won't go into these details. We've already discussed this, that, there is this sort of COVAX partnership. There is a whole country readiness delivery mechanism, because ultimately these programs are implemented by the national programs with partnership support with WHO, UNICEF, Gavi, all coming together to make sure that vaccines are delivered at the country level and all of the guidance is appropriately available. Next slide, please. So from our end, we are making sure that all of the product-related information, all of the training resources, as Dr. Raj was mentioning earlier, the place at which the vaccines are delivered, how are the people trained, is extremely important. So what are we providing to the different partners, to the EPI programs, to make sure that they have the right information, they have all of the training resources available to them to make sure that vaccines are appropriately delivered in those programmatic settings. Next slide, please. And, I just very quickly want to touch on this Ebola vaccine experience, as Dr. Aileen mentioned too, that, we want to make sure that we apply these lessons learned to some of these other public health diseases of public health importance to make sure that we prevent these outbreaks before they occur. And so again, these are some of the lessons learned. These are some of the approaches that we are taking to make sure that a disease like Ebola, we can actually apply some of our COVID lessons to our Ebola program as well. Next slide, please. Again, I don't want to go into a lot of details, but this is also another example of how multiple vaccines can be used in a combined strategy to make sure that vaccines can be used in a reactive as well as in a preventive manner. So there are these WHO recommendations that we want to make sure are implemented appropriately in different settings. And I think I have the last couple slides. Next slide, please. So with this one, what I want to highlight again here is the whole issue of vaccine acceptability. Where does the community engagement really come into play? How do we want to make sure that communities are engaged? So there is some active research happening here. And I think that, I'm actually not able to read these slides very well, but I think when those are distributed later, they should be more legible. But what I want to just highlight here is that the whole approach to community engagement is really, really important to make sure that, what are some of the critical elements? What are things that are important for the communities? How do we understand those and how do we address those? So I think the next slide is just, the approach to making sure that how do we understand the community needs and how can communities get actively engaged? Next slide, please. So yeah, so these are some of the considerations that understanding who are the key, what are the key influencers within the community, who are the different community members and how do they perceive vaccination, what are their real concerns, what are concerns that we can easily address, and how can we make sure that these are implemented within programmatic settings as we move forward. So I would actively encourage community organizations, patient organizations to make sure that we work together as a community with the public sector, with the private sector to make sure that vaccines, again, can be used in a safe, effective, and impactful manner going forward. So that's my last slide. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kashmira. And I must also say it is very pleasant to see you after many days. And,
Same here.
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to begin by coming back to Dr. Socorro on something that, you spoke about and which I thought was very important about the need for building R&D capacity across the globe and particularly focusing on the LMICs. You know that the Gates Foundation and many other organizations are working with WHO to ensure that countries have the power to decide in terms of the products that they use in the country. They have the confidence on the products. And one of the key, solutions for vaccines is ensuring there is an uninterrupted supply of the vaccine. So my question to you is, if you could highlight briefly on how WHO is working with the countries and particularly LMICs to build capacity of regulatory mechanisms in these countries.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raj. Indeed, I think we are really learning from the lessons of Ebola, H1N1, and COVID-19 vaccines that during a pandemic, what really is very crucial to save lives and reduce the impact of pandemic are medical countermeasures, including vaccines and therapeutics. But we have also learned that in the past decades, it really takes a long time to produce vaccine. And with the speeds of how COVID-19 vaccines were produced, it's a big lesson that we are learning that it can be done. But it can be done in a sense that if this capacity is only limited in high-income countries, then at a certain point in time, the production and the manufacture will have a bottleneck, and we have seen that. Like maybe the first few months when some vaccines are already starting to manufacture, and then we are seeing like a stalling of the manufacturing process. So, in broadening the portfolio means also developing capacity in low and middle income countries. So there are several mechanisms as well as points that we are trying to address based also on the lessons that we have learned or we are learning in the COVID-19. First, research and development. It's very intensively needing funding and also capacity building. So by already having cross collaboration between low middle income countries and rich countries in research and development is an important step. And even the Solidarity trial is also a mechanism to stimulate a capacity of research and how low and middle income countries can conduct clinical trial studies at their level. Then the second one is the expansion of the production hub, and the way that we are looking at it is the initiative on technology transfer, and the mechanism is to come up with a hub where the patents, the research and development, the acquisition of the raw material, and the technology are all put in one place, and manufacturers from low and middle income countries will go into that hub and learn the technology and build their capacity. And then we will have the low and middle income countries establish their own manufacturing to manufacture these vaccines. But what is really very important, Dr. Raj and colleagues, that we've seen is the capacity of the national regulatory authorities has really been tested with the COVID-19. So first and foremost, the capacity to oversee research and development, particularly for clinical trial, has really been a challenge. So with the WHO benchmarking mechanism, we have put 7 functions that we grade the national regulatory authorities, and from that, slowly or even in a rapid way, increase their capacity to undertake these functions. The second mechanism is regulatory convergence and reliance, which has really been effectively used during the COVID-19, wherein regulatory authorities that have the capacity share their data and their evaluation to low middle income countries, and low middle income countries can rely on those evaluation and decisions. And this includes the WHO emergency use listing. So I see that we only have 5 minutes, so I'll stop there. But those are the general aspects how WHO is working with countries to strengthen regulations.
Yes, I would like to now move to Dr. Dualan and Dr. Kashmira for the next question. But before I just go there, one thing that I would really like to stress upon is, I think one way the countries learn best and are most comfortable is peer-to-peer learning, that is countries from countries. Some of the countries like India and others have really, worked very hard over the past decade to build their regulatory systems. Maybe, India can work with multiple countries, and WHO and some of the large pharmaceutical companies, Gavi, can come together to support this catalyst role of, bridging between countries. So I would like to really move to Dr. Aileen and Dr. Kashmira, and I have one common question for both of you, given that, we don't have much time. This is such a wonderful session. We have heard of this wonderful partnership, and this is fantastic. And also what we have learned throughout this entire presentation and throughout this COVID period, and that this is not the last pandemic that is going to hit the world. This is something that we need to have for a long-term vision of these partnerships. So could you just highlight, both of you, a little bit on how do we sustain such partnerships between such very, I will say that unthought of partnerships between pharmaceutical companies, between, the global bodies and the pharma companies and all of that. If you have some kind of, insight on how do we sustain such partnerships in the long run, it'll be wonderful. So I'll begin with, I think, Dr. Aileen and then Dr. Kashmira, please.
Thank you for that, Dr. Raj. I think actually we already have these partnerships even before the pandemic. So, for example, J&J and MSD are members of a global organization, Pharma, right? That is really an organization of manufacturers of innovative medicines and vaccines. And through those partnerships in that capacity, there are many things that we are already working on together. So I think there is a way for us to use some of these existing mechanisms and not have to reinvent the wheel in order to sustain some of these activities, right? And then in terms of our partnerships with governments and our partnerships with regulatory authorities, these are things that we're also already doing. But I think it's really time to take it to the next level and be a little bit more systematic and really work more, more closely with each other. And this will also address what you brought up earlier, Dr. Raj, right? I mean, how do we share best practice across the different countries? And this is something that we are very used to doing in the private sector. We actually do this routinely in our companies, right? And I don't see why we can't do that in the public sector as well. So I think there are many avenues for us to continue to working together. And all I can say is I'm still very hopeful for humanity, right? I mean, despite of all the evil that's happening around us, really some good things have come out of this pandemic and some really great partnerships where you really see that people do value lives and they do value public health. And I think we just need to keep the momentum.
Thank you. And Dr. Kashmira, briefly, very briefly. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. I just want to echo what Aileen already said. The other key thing, so in addition to the partnerships that already existed with pharma companies and, what I think was very helpful was that sort of, on the public side of things, so our partnership with WHO, our partnership with the governments to make sure that there was that trusting relationship that was developed, to make sure that data were transparently and quickly shared. And, those sort of like gaps were highlighted to make sure that, this is a very quickly moving phase and evolving phase. So how do we make sure that as manufacturers, we understand the public health needs, and then vice versa, the public health understands what we are doing from the pharma side of things. So we bring those two pieces together. So I feel like those partnerships that have now been established on the regulatory side, on the programmatic side, I think if we can continue those in a systematic fashion, as Aileen said, that will go really very far for the future.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a wonderful insight. Thank you, both of you. Now we will close this session. This is such a wonderful session and I want to continue it for so long now. But before I close and thank all of you, I'll just leave with some parting thoughts. One thing is that, all of us have been working in the field of vaccination for long. In our smallpox eradication, the first public health success in the world, and polio elimination from many, many countries in the world, we had learned that we need to be very efficient in our program. So I'll speak of 5 E's here. The first E that we learned is efficiency. Then came the decade of vaccines, where we learned about equity, the importance of having equity, the second E. The third E that we learned when we tried to introduce new vaccines across the globe was the importance of evidence, that everything that we do must be based on a solid evidence. Therefore, we learned about, the efficiency, we learned about equity, we learned about, evidence. Then as we worked along, we also understood that this could not be done by just few. We needed to empower. We needed to empower the countries. We needed to empower the community in order to deliver all of this. And we were moving along very well with all these 4 E's of efficiency, equity, evidence, and empowerment. When COVID hit us in 2020, we started the program and we had to develop this vaccine so fast and reach such a large population. We learned another E, and that E is so important now for everything that we do in public health, and that E is empathy. Whatever we do, we must be empathetic for the population that we serve, for the underprivileged, for the ones who live in the last mile of the last village of the countries. So therefore, we have learned 5 E's throughout our journey of vaccines around efficiency, equity, around the evidence, around the empowerment. And COVID has taught us that everything that we do, from policy to planning to, everything is around empathy, must be an element in that. With that, I will really like to thank the organizers, and I'll thank you, Dr. Socorro, Dr. Aileen, and Dr. Kashmira, for this fantastic session that we have had today. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much.